It's really a pleasure to kind of carry on the conversation that Rama and Kojo just ended on, which is the future of the creative industries in African markets. So I'm Aubrey Ruby, and I'm a senior fellow at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And this topic is near and dear to my heart because I, 10 years ago, published a book on the creative industries in African markets, and to see where it is today against what it was, even the potential 10 years ago, I couldn't even conceived. And really, I'm here in conversation with an old friend of mine, Eric Guichard, who's the founder and CEO of Home Strings, who's recently authored a report for us at the Africa Center about how to take the growth of the African creative industries to the next level. And in part, that's by monetizing and adding value and capturing more value from all the growth in African music, fashion, film. We know that the industry is worth, $1.5 trillion if you look at the whole market of people of African descent, wherever they live. It could be in the diaspora, which we'll talk about next on the next panel. But in order to do that, one of the greatest challenges we must overcome is a lack of intellectual property rights. And so Eric has authored a new report, and in that report, he really gives us a look at where we are today and what needs to be done. So Eric, tell us a little bit about what the landscape of intellectual property rights looks like today within the continent, and the challenges that result from that structure or lack thereof.
Absolutely, thank you, Ruby. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to do this report, and specifically to Janine Scott, Ben Mossberg, and Masiri Yansene, as well as the Ambassador Yad as well. I think writing this report or doing research for this report was mind-blowing. In most part because of the size, the sheer size of the intellectual property that's being created by African creators on the continent. But at the same time, despite that volume of creation, there is some limitations in the lack of protection around those creations. And as a result, the creators have difficulty in monetizing their creations, and therefore there's lost wealth. But even at the national level, there's a loss of opportunity to repatriate foreign exchange, which ultimately strengthens the economy. And so, based on that reality, the question was, what are the major
yeah, and there's
issues
also a challenge of financing it, right? Because you can't finance the asset if you don't own it.
That's correct.
And this is such a long and very challenging topic when it comes to Black creators.
That's correct. Globally,
right? Mm-hmm. And if you look even the history of music in the United States, how many Black artists were denied the rights to the royalties for what they created. Yeah. And so this issue is a big one, but the question is, even in a changing technology with social media and even more creation capacity, what is being done today about it in the region?
No, absolutely. The fragmentation of intellectual property protections on the continent is significant. 54 countries. Almost half of them have their own, no harmonization, and therefore the lack of those strong protections, as you said, reduces the opportunity for monetization. And then the question is, what do you do about that? Now, prop has to be given to Afreximbank with their initiatives in and around protecting creatives' rights, as well as enhancing access to finance, but it's not enough. And the question is, how do you address that? Well, it turns out that, in the US, those protections around intellectual property run deep. The U.S. Patent and Trade Office, goes back to the 1800s in terms of case law in protecting intellectual property. Many diasporans have, created intellectual property and have protected it in big markets like the U.S. and were able to use those case laws to protect and generate, revenues, royalties for misuse or even proper use of the intellectual property rights. So here, in this write-up, I recommend that access be given to African creatives, particularly in the film, fashion, and music industries, to have access to the ability to protect their intellectual property rights in the US market. It is a global marketplace. The consumption of African creations, whether it's music, whether it's fashion, whether it's film, is a global consumption market. And piracy is also global.
Yeah.
The people who are pirating African creations are not necessarily in Timbuktu or Johannesburg. They're sitting in Brussels and New York and Idaho, for that matter. And so providing access to those kind of protections give African creatives, no matter who they are, the ability to have recourse and therefore have access to wealth creation, which I think is the ultimate objective.
So giving access for the US Patent and Trade Office, what would that look like? And how would you respond to those who believe that African creators and governments need homegrown solutions?
Absolutely.
And local kind of tech-enabled solutions? So can those things run in parallel? What would it look like?
No, so I addressed that issue in the report. These propositions are not mutually exclusive. The issue is protecting creations now so that they can monetize them now, while the 54 states and the regional bodies and the Africa Exim Bank work on, and the AFCTA for that matter, work on harmonizing intellectual property protections and enforcement on the continent. They're not mutually exclusive, right? In fact, I go so far as to recommend that creatives register not only domestically and regionally through these organizations, but also register within the US in order to monetize today their creations.
And then what do you see as local homegrown? Can you give some examples of what's happening, maybe from a tech perspective?
No, absolutely. I was pleasantly surprised to find at least 3 case studies of African homegrown solutions using technology. One of them, particularly in the music industry, is Mdundo.com, which in fact came to the problem of protecting intellectual property rights through trying to reduce piracy of African music. And so through technology, they were able to create an environment where small musicians can register, have their music downloaded, be paid initially through advertising dollars, and then subsequently through big relationships with large music companies based out of the US. Similarly, Udux, udux.com, also has about 5 million members who are streaming African music, and they also provide visual access to worldwide concerts. And then you have new creations such as poprep.dev, which uses a new technology called tokenization, where the tokens issued by musicians can help them raise money, small amounts of money, almost like crowdfunding, so that they can fund their growth. And this is particularly important for small musicians who are not well known, don't have the large streaming volumes on large platforms like Spotify.
Yeah, I mean, you saw a big movement towards that, the NFT kind of approach. And for example, I think of Osinachi, the Nigerian artist who was the first to issue an NFT at Christie's. I don't know if that's waning now. It seems like it's much less pushed and people have reverted back to a little bit more traditional models. But perhaps in the African context where, I think of Nigeria as one of the world's largest users of crypto and tokenization, it's even more readily adaptable.
Sure. No, I think there are 2 things. One, there's a technology. So the technology will remain and will grow, and its applicability will also grow. The hoopla around NFTs and underlying technologies, that's waning away as the technology moves into the mainstream.
And so, Eric, as we think about where we are today, which is a group of different regulatory bodies in African markets, and then you have non-regulatory players, which are these innovators, and then of course US PTO, which they have a bigger agenda that's not just Africa. How do we move forward? What are some key recommendations? Maybe you can go through 3 recommendations you have to maybe US government types, to African DFIs, or to African governments, and to creators themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in the short term, a relationship with the U.S. Patent and Trade Office is critical, and I think Africa Exim Bank should link up with the USPTO to create a window that will fit their training program, their skills enhancement program for creatives in terms of securing their intellectual property rights. And there, again, policymakers, part of the U.S. foreign policy strategy could include providing that. Now, I think it's important to note that Chinese companies, Russian companies who are also creatives list their companies on the U.S. market, secure their creatives on the U.S. market. There's no reason why Africans couldn't do the same thing. So, and the U.S. market, just to provide some numbers, USPTO total size of the value of patents and licenses is about $6 trillion, which is about 25% of the U.S. GDP. It's quite significant. And in terms of financing, the U.S. represents about $50 trillion in terms of capital markets size, which is the largest in the world. So it is a missed opportunity not to connect. The second recommendation, I think, should be that the African Bank, again, and other funders should look at these innovators, Ndundo, UDEX, PopRev, and others, and provide capital to those companies so they can grow and basically cover more of the footprint in Africa. And they're not the only ones, obviously. And then last but not least, I think harmonizing between the various agencies that secure intellectual property rights on the continent through the Africa Free Trade Agreement, that should happen. It's a longer term proposition because you have to take into account mandates, et cetera. But I think that should be part of the sort of long-term recommendations.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is very valuable about this report is that often it's felt like the intellectual property issue has been brought forth by American companies saying we need our IP protected in these markets. For example, a Starbucks, someone making a logo that looks like Starbucks, putting coffee shops on a street, say in Addis, this kind of thing. And so it seemed like it's almost like a Western, regime being imposed. But here you actually have homegrown assets that are not fully protected.
Correct.
In the same way that you have the discussion about rooibos tea and other African medicinal remedies that aren't fully protected. And so I'm excited to see much more discussion of like homegrown need versus the idea that it's just being imposed from the outside.
No, absolutely. I think the more and more creatives understand the power of their creation, the monetary value of their creation, the collateral nature of their creation in terms of securing loans and other sources of financing, the more we'll see the realization of that larger value. My interest, particularly in music, film, and fashion, was because those three, from a GDP standpoint, are quite significant in terms of the image of Africa that's being projected out into the world. And if you can monetize that and create converging incentives that people can actually make money by projecting, Africa music, African fashion, and the rest of it, I think, you'll see a transformed continent, basically.
And it's a form of, we've talked many times about the need for infrastructure around the creative industries. Like, think about a Burna Boy trying to perform in Nigeria. There's not even stadiums big enough, right? It's hard for them to monetize theirs just from concerts and things because of lack of infrastructure. But this is another form of infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Right? The legal infrastructure that allows for deep monetization. And so, if you had to leave our audience with our last minute here with a tone of optimism, do you see this as moving forward, or what makes you excited about the sector?
So two things make me excited. One, as I mentioned before, the fact that you have homegrown solutions that are being, despite all the challenges, that are being implemented and being grown. They clearly need additional capital, and I think they can find additional capital through some of the recommendations that we've made. And number two, there is no lack of creativity when it comes to African youth. I think what is most exciting to me in writing this report is that we've been talking about youth unemployment for as long as I've been a professional. And I think writing about this, discovering the opportunity that this presents in terms of solving, at least in part, youth unemployment, giving the youth through technology the ability to secure wealth on their own terms is transformative. I think, and my hope is that in the next 3 to 5 years, that policymakers will listen to the importance of the creatives as a development pillar, not as an afterthought from a policy standpoint, but as a huge, significant, transformative pillar right there with manufacturing and agriculture and energy. I think that to me is the shining the shining star in the horizon.
Well, thank you, Eric, for this overview of the report. For the audience here, you can download it. Maybe they'll flash up the QR code here, and it's available on the website if you want to dig in. So thank you for joining us
Thanks for
today,
having
and
me.
it's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you.